I got commissioned to write a book a few years ago. This is it right here. Shameless self-promotion. I will be at the Oldsmobiles periodically. Today I can sell some. But while doing this book, I knew about this Oldsmobile that I used to see on Facebook, this Project W31. I wanted to learn a little bit more about it, but I knew nothing about it. And then this gentleman right here, Casey Marks, sent me a Society of Automotive Engineers magazine from Michigan State University. Had everything about this group. The team members at the time, I guess 1971 it was, and I had some names. So I started using social media to try to find some of the gentlemen. And I found, at the time when I had to submit my book, I found 3. However, 2 years later, now we have a whole bunch more. Casey, Ryan Weaver, and I, and these gentlemen wrote an article for Muscle Car Review, and we have a gentleman here that'll be telling you everything you want to know about this, and then some. So I'd like to thank the gentlemen for coming, and I'd like to thank you guys for expressing interest in this story. And I'm going to lead off with Paul Arand.
Thank you, Diego. My name is Paul Arand, and I was one of the original core members of this group, which actually started forming in 1969. We're going to talk you through how we got the car, what we did to the car to prepare the car. We're going to talk about what we, how we raced the car, some of the events and times around racing it, and then the latter years, which will be 1973-74 era. And what happened after that, and how the program ended. So that's what you're going to hear today. And I am going to quickly introduce the group, all of which were engineers and graphic designers that were car nuts during that time. And from my far left, we've got Bob Sink. He spent his career in transmissions. Al Wilson, he spent his career in exotic metals. Mr. Joe Guzik, Motor Wheel Corporation, and sponsor of the group during the formation period. Bob Dennis spent his career in instrument panels. Bob Sedlak was an aerodynamics expert. Fred Bowen spent his career in harnesses and wiring. Dennis Klein was our car designer who did a lot of the graphics for the car. Jim Miniker spent his career building some super engines for the auto industry. And Rick Dolan spent his career producing lighting components for the auto industry. So I guess you'd say we have the car pretty well surrounded. And you're looking at about 350 years worth of engineering experience here on stage for you. Anyway, I'm not going to spend any more time on us. I'm going to turn it over to Jim Miniker, who is going to run us through the exciting part of how we got Oldsmobile to give us a practically brand new W31.
Thank you, Paul. SAE Student Chapter, Society of Automotive Engineers. Primarily a group of ME students joined that society to intermingle with other engineers, graduate engineers, to understand what the automotive business was all about. We met once a month, Thursday night. Aside from collecting dues and formalities of meetings, and listening to presentations on all things automotive engineering, we look forward to the after hours where we went to Monty's Bar and occupied a circular table where we began to tell our war stories of all our racing and car experience that we had gathered at the ripe old age of 21. Our advisors, which were Jim Miller from Oldsmobile Engineering and Joe Guzik from Motor Wheel. Joe's with us here tonight. At one of those events, threw the gauntlet down. Jim Miller said, "You guys are nothing but talk. I hear you talking about racing, I hear you talking about cars. I'm not sure, I don't believe that if I gave you guys a race car that you'd be able to campaign it." So we deliberated for about 5 minutes, Said, "You think we can do this?" I mean, it is a big undertaking. Decided that yes, we would commit that kind of time to this kind of project, and said, "Here's what we want." Jim conferred with Dale Smith, who was really the motivating factor about getting the youth back into Oldsmobile via racing, and they decided to present us with a 1969. Turned out to be a 442, but with all the W31 package in it. With one stipulation: we had to have a shop in which we could work on it. There was no such shop in any of the engineering buildings, mechanical, electrical, or so on. That's where Rick Dolan picks up the story, working on the shop.
Thanks, Jim. Well, no pun intended, the shop was really Spartan. It was an old agricultural building that was used by senior students in trying to create mechanized harvesting equipment. At one point in time, it was called a blacksmith shop, and I honestly don't know whether it was used to shoot horses or whatever, but at any rate, it was about that bad. It was a wood frame structure. It did have electricity. It did have lights. It had no heat. And the floor was some dirt and a little bit of macadam. And other than the tools that the team members had in the trunk of their car, all we had to work with was an old Lincoln tombstone welder, a set of acetylene torches, and a floor jack, a sizable floor jack. At any rate, from those humble beginnings, we put this car together. And one vivid recollection I have is that somewhere along the way we had to borrow the torque wrench to put the heads back on the car. And so we would beg, borrowing, and stealing. I shouldn't say stealing, because we never did that. But it was a tough road to hoe, but we actually pulled it together and made it work.
Thanks, Rick. It was definitely an interesting place. We called it a workshop, and we used that term when we called up Mr. Jim Miller at Oldsmobile Engineering and said, "Jim, we found ourselves a workshop." And he didn't, fortunately, insist on looking at the workshop before he went ahead and arranged to get us his car. But he hung up the phone and he said, "Paul, let me see what I can do." And about 2 weeks later, early part of the winter term of 1970, so around January, I was sitting in the dorm, Wonders Hall. I remember the room number 234 like it was yesterday, and I got a phone call. We didn't have cell phones those days, so we each had a phone in our room, and it was Jim Miller, and he said, "Paul, be down in front of the dormitory in 15 minutes, and he said, "Paul, don't bring anybody else along, please." And so he came by with his company car, and I got in, and it was about 9 o'clock at night in the winter. We drove through the streets of East Lansing and Lansing, and we came to the parking lot of the engineering building where the test cars were kept. And he got out of the car, and he grabbed a key out of his pocket and opened the padlock and swung open the gate, and we drove in and parked next to this red 69 Cutlass. And he reached into his other pocket and he handed me a set of keys, and he said, "Paul, this vehicle has no VIN number. It's been taken out of the car. The title's been sent to Lansing. It has no registration. It has no insurance, and it has no plates. It doesn't exist." He said, "Don't get caught." So I got in that car and drove through the streets of Lansing back into East Lansing and got to the workshop where a couple of the guys were there. They swung open the doors, and we drove the car in and closed the doors, and I guess you'd say the project began at that point. Who's going to start this? Fred's going to start the quick summary of what we did to prepare the car for racing. I understand this is the winter of 1970. and we first raced the car in the spring of 1970. So what Fred's going to talk to you about is what we did over the winter in this very Spartan, unheated shop that Rick just told you about. Fred?
Okay, thank you, Paul. Well, the first thing we needed to do was acquire some speed parts and other components to make the car race worthy. Okay. So we began a letter writing project where some of us would write letters to speed parts manufacturers explaining that we were engineering students who had a project car that we were going to drag race, and we needed some components such as a scatter shield for the 4-speed transmission and clutch, and a tachometer and other various components, racing seat belts and so forth. So we wrote letters. The first gentleman to do that was Jim Miniker, and he fortunately got a positive response from several of the manufacturers. Lakewood Industries that supplied us with a scatter shield. Schaefer provided a clutch for us. Stuart Warner gave us a tachometer. And there are other manufacturers, really too numerous to mention or that I can think of right off the top of my head, who provided parts for us. But we did receive some rejections from some manufacturers, which we expected. But overall, the response from the speed parts community was very gratifying. So we were able to begin preparation of the car. And we did that by scraping all of the seam sealer and sound deadener and undercoating off the car, which required many hours with propane torches and putty knives and screwdrivers and such. It took a lot of work to do that, and to change out components that the car had, such as it was equipped originally with power disc brakes. Those were converted to drum brakes, manual drum brakes. Changed the front springs, put Pontiac Tempest soft front springs in the car for better weight transfer and lift on the starting line at the drag strip. We also acquired through our good friend Joe Guzik, Motor Wheel provided the Spider wheels that the car has, and also the Goodyear drag slicks and lightweight front runner tires. And with these components, we managed to configure the car to get it into the configuration necessary to take drag racing. Okay, Bob Dennis can add some additional comments to that.
I'm Bob Dennis. I was part of that year, graduated when Fred did in 1970. Some of the other things we did to prepare the car, we modified the 4-speed to make it what was so-called a crash box. We did that by reading the magazine articles about Lavadiols and what's the George, the other, I can't recall the second name. Anyway, we duplicated Victor George. Thanks, Paul. I spent a lot of hours in the basement of the engineering building with a grinding wheel and transmission components. Paul did some of that too. We also, some of us modified the heads by porting and polishing them. We did have a professional valve grinding job done on the car. A lot of other just grunt work that all of you who've worked on race cars knows there's a lot of it and it takes a long time. We finally added decals to our car for all of the parts we were able to get from mostly generous vendors. And we always tried to keep the decals up to date and send photos back to the donating companies of our car. Now we finally had it ready to take it racing for the first time at Onondaga Dragway. Bob Sedlak's going to tell you about the trip to Onondaga Dragway.
Hi, I'm Bob Sedlak. In April of 1970, we finished the work on the car, but we had no way to get the car to the dragway. One student's father had an old hay wagon on his farm in Hastings, Michigan. So we went out there, pulled with a tractor the hay wagon out of the field. And the hay wagon itself weighed as much as the tow vehicle, about 3,000 pounds, because it was cast iron and angle iron. And then we put this W31 on the trailer and towed it to Onondaga, almost. The problem with the car is that it always wanted to pass the tow vehicle. And the first long downhill we came to, we realized we were in trouble because I looked in the rearview mirror and there was no race car. And I looked in the side view mirror and it was trying to pass. So we had to figure out very quickly what speed to drive the car so that we would at least keep the car on the trailer and behind the tow vehicle. We got it to Onondaga, and the next person on the list should explain how we raced the car at Onondaga and how well the car did, especially its first time out.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. You under-exaggerated that little trip. I happened to be right behind Bob when he was driving that, and I thought for sure the whole thing was going in the ditch. There was probably 10 inches between the unfendered single-axle tires and the doors. And when we finally got to the racetrack, there were big black marks on the doors, both doors. And I think what really happened was Paul was in the right-hand seat and had, with Bob, had a little towing background and was hollering at poor Bob, who put his own car in jeopardy to do this. And said, stand on the throttle, stand on the throttle. And if you've ever got into that situation, that's exactly what you got to do. In fact, as racers, you're always taught stand on. If you don't know what's going on with a car, you stand on the throttle. And that pulled it through the resonance period. It had a resonance at about 60 miles an hour. And then Paul says, stand on the brake, stand on the brake. And he drove down through the resonance and got it down below the resonance, and then we towed it 40 miles an hour the rest of the way. Anyways, we went on to Onondaga that first trip. I happened to get the driving assignment, as I recall. Now I've been a street racer and done some minor drag racing, but you know, that was the background of my experience. Now this car had it had a 5-to-1 final drive ratio. Right, this was we put together this package with. We know the 350 4-speed and trailer towing axle ratio, which was all legal. The car has been set up for NHRA G stock, right? And we tried to build it to all the rules. This was not a cheater car. We were trying to run on the national record. You know, big aspiration. The national record at the time was 12:28. We checked Diego. We found a national dragster from spring of 1970. It was 12:28 at the time we started this. May have been higher than that when we started the project, I don't recall. But we put the package together because we thought that would be competitive. And so our first event, my first time, you bring the thing up to 6,000 RPM, drop the clutch, and the front end races. You know, we got 6 cylinder springs in it. You can see the pictures. I mean, it really raced pretty high. And then second gear comes in a big hurry, and it's we put this crash box together, which means you can't shift it lightly, right? It's got no synchronizers and every other tooth removed from the slider, and you just hammer it and pull gears, right? Second, third, all the way to the fourth. Went through the lights at roughly 6,000 RPM, top end. We were able to run right near 13 flat at 100 mile an hour, and did that pretty consistently throughout my time with the car, which was spring of 1970. I graduated in 70, so I ran it in Onondaga and at Tri-City, and I think we ended up with a couple of trophies as a result of that. So we were competitive on a regional level, beat cars that were qualified for the nationals, and did pretty well. We're pretty proud of it. I was, you know, some of the guys got their head hung down, and the national record went below that during that year, got down to 12:22 or 12:12, I'm told. So we never got an invite to the nationals, but that wasn't the purpose. You know, the purpose was to understand how to build and campaign a race car while you're being a student, right? I mean, we already had a full-time job. And then, of course, we met this wonderful group of people here that have turned out to be really good professionals and added a lot of value to the engineering community in general and society. So we're really proud of that whole endeavor. The guys, of course, moved on. Fred and Bob were kind of the key folks. This Bob and I and Paul and Rick graduated in calendar year 70. And then some of the other guys, of course, came on, many of which I had never met until November of last year when Casey and Ryan and Diego pulled us all together. So here was guys on my team that I hadn't never met, and it's 45 years ago. Well, what a thrill it's been for us, me personally, and the whole team to come back together here. And so the last year has just been a ball. We've been sending emails back and forth like schoolgirls. You know, did you hear that? Did you hear over here? You know, what about this? Where do you think the car is? You know, where is the car? So, so some of the other guys, Bob and Fred and other Bob, got 3 Bobs here, by the way, so you got to be careful. Bob and Bob, and Al raced it later, and if they'd like to talk about some of their experiences, I invite them up here to do that. Bob, sing.
Good afternoon. I was later in the event of all this. The car was already put together. I got involved in '71. Probably the most notable in that, when these guys graduated in the spring of '71, we raced the car that summer. Towards the end of that summer, we did our tryouts on. There was a commuter lot at MSU that had a big parking lot that all the day students came in, and at night when they left, we would take the car out there and do our tune-ups and stuff at the end of this track. Bob has an interesting story of that, but one of those times we're out there on I believe it was a Friday night, running to race Saturday. The guy gets on it, and when he hits second gear, it just is a big bang, and we blew an engine. All we did was when we tore it down and did our analysis, one of the rod bolts had come loose. Apparently we either didn't torque it correctly or something, but it had backed off, and it basically just, when we were out in the middle of it's like 10 o'clock at night, we got our flashlights and we're pulling spark plugs. Okay, I'll get a little closer. We're pulling spark plugs. We looked down the cylinder, and one of the cylinders, all you saw was the crank. So the piston is just ate the piston, did not puncture the pan. When we pull it apart, the pan was a bunch of dimples in it. The pan didn't fail, but all our piston and rod was in it. We ended up, at that time, towing it because we had no place on MSU to store it. They didn't want us to do anything more on campus. We ended up towing it to my dad's farm north of Owasso, Michigan. Used a tractor and a boom to pull the engine, and we got another engine to drop back in it. So that's kind of one of the stories I had.
Thank you, Bob. I think at this point in time, we're going to turn it over to Dennis Klein. because Dennis has basically taken upon himself the task of answering the question, whatever happened to this car? And he's got kind of a wild story that I'm sure that you're going to enjoy hearing. And I'm not going to give you a spoiler alert yet, so hang in there. So let me give you Dennis. Dennis, our designer, he did the graphics on the car. He also has done a slide presentation, which we'll show in just, you'll see in just a minute as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start off by putting the microphone in my mouth so that I don't get coached on that 5 times. But yeah, I was the outcast of this group because I was not an engineering major. I was an engineering minor, and my major was industrial design or Bachelor of Fine Arts. But I had to minor in engineering, and my roommate told me one day, he says, "Hey, you like racing. You know that they have a race car here, and you can get college credit towards your minor if you go race the car?" I said, "What now?" And that's how I got with the group. And it was one of the most exciting things that I had an opportunity to do in college. But like any other college kid, we graduated and we all went on to have our lives. And we had families and we got careers. And I don't think any one of us thought about that race car that we left behind on the campus of Michigan State University. And Diego, Casey, and Ryan Weaver started bringing us together a little over, I guess, a year and a half, 2 years now. And it was the first time I'd heard from anybody in 45 years. So we started getting together, and we had a meeting in January where we were trying to take 10 minds and make one good one that could remember things. So we were taking all these bits and pieces, piecing together the stories. And one of the things that I remembered was the first full power blast we did with open headers in the commuter lot at Michigan State University at night. We took the car out there to see how it would launch, and somebody said, "Well, you've never driven the car, how would you like to ride in it?" And I'd never been in a car with open headers. So I got in, I was so excited, it was so loud, it was the most exciting thing I'd ever done in my life. We launched the car, I think it was Bob Dennis driving, and as he's banging through the gears, I saw a flash of light in front of the car, and I screamed, "Chain!" And there was a chain across the parking lot. We slammed on the brakes, we slid to the chain as I'm having visions of being decapitated, and the chain came up the hood, stopped right at the windshield, and cracked the windshield. So, that was my first adventure. We get together last January, and we're all at this restaurant, and this gentleman walks in, kind of scruffy looking, and he says, "Who's Dennis Klein?" That's me. He says, "Well, you're one of the guys I remember." And he starts pointing out guys, and we start talking about the car. And he goes, "Well, you know the car still exists, don't you?" And we go, "What?" He says, "Yeah, I saw it in 2009. And he describes that he saw this car outside of the Demmer Engineering Building on East Grand River in Lansing. Does anybody know the Demmer name in here, with all you Oldsmobile enthusiasts? They built the Hearst-sold Olds in 1968. So I became more interested in finding the car and letting these other guys tell and recant the story for the magazine article. And I can tell you, you can go over here to this barn find area, and finding those barn finds is not easy, especially when they don't have a VIN number or a title. It's not like a needle in a haystack, it's much, much worse. So we knew that the first thing we had to do was get the word out so that people that might be familiar with the car could come forward. So what do? When you need free publicity, you put an ad on Craigslist. So I put an ad on Craigslist, wanted information about MSU race car from 1969 through 73. Not knowing what I would get. And within a couple hours of posting that Craigslist ad, I started getting phone calls. And some of them were very, very interesting. And one of the first ones I got was from a GM engineer, and he says, I don't know where your car is now, but I know where it was in 1977. Well, we hadn't seen the cars, most of us, in 73, some of us from 74, but no one had seen it in 77. And he says, as a matter of fact, I can send you pictures of it in 1977 in a Marathon gas station. So that started the hunt. We got pictures of it sitting in a Marathon gas station. He gave me the name of the family that ran the gas station. I went onto the internet and I started tracking people down. Gas station owner has passed away. Got in touch with his widow. His widow doesn't remember, but she had an 18-year-old son in 1977. I tracked down the 18-year-old son, and he says, don't know anything about the car. And I say, wait a minute, you were 18 and your dad had a race car in his gas station and you don't know anything about it. Well, I lived in Denver, Colorado for 10 years. So that's the way it started, one dead end after another. The same engineer from GM calls me back and says, I know a guy that worked at that gas station. Here's his name. I go on the internet, I track him down. He says, yes, I worked there. Yes, I remember the car. No, I don't know anything else. And it was one thing after another as we went down the list. And of course, since the car was sited at a Demmer facility, Paul actually graduated with Bill Demmer. We thought it would be the easiest thing in the world to get another fellow Oldsmobile enthusiast excited about helping us. So lots of calls went out, lots of letters went out, emails in detail with no response. And this goes on and on and on. So I finally figured out that I've got to organize my hunt. Not only can it be Craigslist ads, it's got to be more than that. And I contacted the Lansing State Journal, and I was asking for a clean copy of the 1971 article on the car. And they said, well, why don't you talk to the MSU writer's desk? So I went to the MSU's writer's desk, and I told my story very quickly to the writer. And he said, hey, this is really, really interesting. Can I write a story about your hunt? And I said yes. So he interviewed a couple of the team members, and he wrote a story. And he kept communicating with me, the story's coming, the story's coming. I was expecting, you know, fourth page in, small, one column, maybe, story about the MSU Project W31. Next thing I know, I get a call. It's the front page story of the Lansing State Journal. We couldn't believe it. We circulated the story among all the members, and we were just astounded. And the story was really not only about the car, but also about the search itself. So, as we try to figure out how do you find a barn-find car that's disappeared for almost 40-some years, that allegedly was seen in 2009, there was a list. MSU professors who were involved. Well, guess what? The MSU professors who were involved were deceased. We had team members and ex-team members, and we began searching and talking to each and every team member that we could. Veteran racers. I had kind of a rule that I didn't want to talk to any racers unless they had no hair or white hair, because that's the kind of hair you have after all these years. A couple of those guys pointed me to different people in the racing industry, and I started following up. That car was raced by Dick Fortman. And if you do any research on Oldsmobiles, Dick Fortman was a pretty famous racer. Well, Dick Fortman passed away. I talked to his widow. Now, she doesn't remember anything about it. And then a young racer calls me, and he says, that car is being raced by so-and-so over near Saginaw. So the search began as I started tracking down one of these after another. And I found out that the Oldsmobile community is very, very tight. Anybody that knows Oldsmobiles probably knows Judy Badgley and her son Calvin Badgley in the Lansing area. They gave me some suggestions of people to go to. A photographer in the Lansing area that works for the R.E. Olds Museum, Margaret Herb, she gave me some leads. And one of those leads was, you need to talk to Joe Guzik. Well, Joe Guzik's right here, and Joe was instrumental in the whole team. Every third person I talked to said, you need to talk to Joe Guzik about anything Oldsmobile. Ex-Oldsmobile employees, engineers became a target, and they meet every Wednesday morning at some breakfast for retirees, and this became a topic of discussion. The engineers that were involved in giving us the car, Mr. Miller and Dale Smith, but to track them down, both of them were deceased. Then I got recommendations to talk to an engine builder. Talk to an engine builder who says, I have your engine. We're still searching that one down. Oldsmobile Restorers. There's an Oldsmobile restorer in Jackson, Michigan that I was told if anybody restored that car, he would know. I called him. He said, no, I've never restored it, never heard of it, but you need to talk to Joe Guzik. Then I found out that our sponsors from 1970 were still in business. Denny's Sunoco is now Denny's Auto Diagnostics. Less than 1,000 feet away from Denny's Sunoco was Johnson Speed Warehouse, Roy Johnson, and they're still in business. And then of course the next building down the street is Demmer. As I talked to each one of these businessmen, they told me, you need to get a hold of the Demmers. So we continued calling them. Somebody suggested that perhaps the car went to a salvage yard. So I called every salvage yard in the Lansing area. And guess what? It's a crime to receive a car into a salvage yard if you do not have the title. So every salvage yard told me no, they don't have it. What a surprise. So we continued with our search, now on to writing this magazine article for Muscle Car Review that's being distributed here in this hall. And as soon as that Muscle Car Review article went out, I started getting more calls. And I got a call from a gentleman at 10 o'clock at night in my home. He says, I know where your car is. Where is it? Well, I just saw a big story about it in Muscle Car Review. Just call them. Then I get a call from a gentleman and he says, I don't know where your car is now, but I know where it was in 2013. And I said, where was that? And he said, in the Demmer Museum. Interesting. So I didn't want to lead him on at all with any facts. I said, tell me about our car. What does it look like? And the first thing he said was, it's got motor wheel, spider wheels on it. And it does have motor wheel, spider wheels. And he says, you know, that comes from Motor Wheel. You know, Joe Guzik works there. And he said, in this museum, there is the original 4-speed Hearst Olds, and there's the Smothers Brothers car sitting right next to your car. And I said, well, how did you know it was our car other than the wheels? And he said, I pulled the cover back and it said Michigan State on it. So the search has continued. The leads have continued to come in, but I'm sad to say, we didn't come to the show with a car, we came to the show with a banner that says it's lost. So we're hoping that all of you that are listening that are interested in Oldsmobiles will continue to spread the word. And sooner or later, if that car exists, I think we're going to find out about it. And if it doesn't exist for whatever reason, I think whoever was involved in its salvage or taking the engine out of it, or perhaps even if it was scrapped, they're going to come forward and start talking about it. So we've got a number of things coming up. The Lansing State Journal is going to run another follow-up story, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And then there's a television affiliate of ABC TV that's going to do a 10-minute, 6 to 10-minute story about the car. And we will reach even a broader audience than we've reached so far with Craigslist ads and Lansing State Journal articles. So, Paul.
Thank you, Dennis. I thought you might find that interesting. We have been hanging on every email for the past 6 months, and whenever Dennis sends something out, we can't wait to open it, but hopefully we'll get there. I'd like to open this up to questions from the audience, and Ryan Weaver, if you don't know him, he just brought a beautifully restored W31 car to the show. It sits right next to where our car would be if we brought ours to the show. We're slackers, and we didn't quite get it done. So he's got a mic. If you'd have a question, raise your hand. He'll get the mic to you, and we've got, I think, 10 minutes here. If you have any questions for us, we'd love to hear them.
Test.
Who was the catalyst behind all this?
Hey, the question is, who is the catalyst behind all this? I'm assuming that question means who got this whole thing started. It really all goes back to the infamous pitcher of beer at Monty's Bar in Okemos, Michigan, which Monty's doesn't exist anymore, but it's a beautiful old place. It had wooden floors and very high seats and a big old round table and $1 pitchers. But it was a result of our relationship with Jim Miller. Jim Miller was an engineer at Oldsmobile, and he was the de facto representative for our team. He'd come to our meetings, and Fred reminds me that he was also taking engineering classes at the time. And it was a result of discussions, friendly bantering at first about us being a worthless bunch of student engineers that didn't do anything, and the ultimate challenge of let's do something as a project. So it evolved out of a friendly discussion of trying to find something for a group of engineers to do while we were going to school. Does that answer your question?
How is back then? How did you guys all get back together?
He's just asking how all the group got back together and how this all got started to put everything back together now, like current day.
Oh, okay. Well, it's all because of Ryan and Casey and Diego and their passion for this particular mark of car, and the fact that they found an article written by Fred Moen in July of 1970 about the group and what we were doing at the time, and somehow somebody put it on and digitized it, and Ryan and Casey found it, and because of their interest and persistence, they got a hold of us, and we got a hold of each other, and eventually pulled it all back together. Thank you.
So maybe, Bob, Dennis, real quick, could you tell we talked about Jim Miller, could you tell the Dale Smith part?
No.
When Fred and I had the car and we wanted to test it on the south lot at campus, towing the car was a lot of work, and if you wanted to put it together and then take it just a little ways off campus, a half mile, you had to hook up the tow bar, lay under the car, pull the drive shaft, do a lot of work. So dumb me, I thought, well, why don't we just call Oldsmobile, see if we can get some kind of provisional title or some kind of ability to legally drive it just around to the south end of campus. So the next thing I know, Jim Miller's telling me, what are you doing? You're going to get somebody fired. That car doesn't even exist. You shouldn't be calling Oldsmobile. But then in Dale Smith's book, he says, he starts mentioning something, I don't know if I'll get it right here, but some dumb shit calls me and says, and I'm thinking, oh man, I know who that is. Well, it turned out Dale wasn't the least bit fazed by me calling them and exposing that we had the car. He was concerned that some dumb shit in Oldsmobile PR was resenting the fact that we got the car. And I've never lived it down amongst these guys for calling Oldsmobile, just causing basically trouble. Here's the article.
This is Dale Smith's book. He published a brief book, Racing to the Past, Oldsmobile and Its Demise. And essentially his charge was to get the youth back into Oldsmobile, and he did that through racing, including some circle track racing, Jim Garner off-road, and so on and so forth. And, it said, and I'm just going to skip around here, I had to be careful how I got rid of the cars. The fact that they were unregistered cars did not matter to the racers, since they trailered the cars to the racetrack. I told the racers not to register the cars since it would not be good for me. I did get a car for engineering students at Michigan State. Since they could not afford a trailer, well, we had one, it didn't work. They called Olds Public Relations to attempt to get the car registered so they could drive the car to the drag racing events. That's not true. We flat-toed it. We just wanted to move it around.
Only to the south of campus.
Yeah. I then received a call from a dumb shit informing me that I had violated the General Motors racing ban and that I had better get the car back before I got into deep trouble. So that's some of the sidebar stuff that went on. I told him I was not afraid of getting into trouble unless a pinhead like him would squeal to the head of General Motors. I told him, I'm reading this, folks, I told him the bottom line on why you, me, or anyone else here exists to sell cars. In my job, I'm trying to improve Oldsmobile use image and cultivate new customers. If you can't understand that concept, you might as well piss in your whiskey. That, sir, is the beginning of it.
Vintage Dale Smith. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I imagine there's quite a few high schools that had shop classes that may or may not have worked on race cars, but was MSU the only collegiate level engineering department that was involved with race cars, or were there smaller colleges that you guys were aware of that were also sponsoring cars, or it was just pretty unique with MSU?
Well, we aren't exactly sure the total history, and there may have been other schools and such. Dale Smith himself said that he gave out a lot of cars to schools. I don't know what that means, but to the best of our knowledge, we are the first SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers, in student groups that ever did any racing. And any of you that know the Society of Automotive Engineers today know that they sponsor many, many different series, the Solar Challenge, the Baja Challenge, and a number of other specialty events that they sponsor.
Formula SAE was going for a while. I don't know if it still is.
Right. And as far as I know, we were the very first, and we were not really supported by SAE. They didn't know how to handle us, quite frankly. So maybe we were pioneers. I don't know. Any other questions?
I have a question. I actually have two questions. How did you guys pick the driver of the car? Was that like a draw of sticks, or somebody that was just interested in racing from you guys?
The entire part of this project, and maybe it was the unique part, is that this was a team effort. What we tried to do is include as many people with an interest in racing in the engineering community, and we even accepted non-engineers that had an interest. It didn't matter. We actively put the car out in front of the engineering building. We have pictures of that that Dennis has, trying to promote membership into the SAE chapter. And the members did that entirely on their own. And we tried to encourage people to come in, and if you didn't know how to work on a car, if you didn't know the first thing about working on the car, and many of these guys that went on and had a very strong engineering career, and some are actually drag racing today, admit that they came into the group without any practical knowledge. So the guys that had the knowledge shared it with the other guys. In the same way with driving, everybody that wanted to, as far as I know, anybody that wanted to got a shot at driving. And we weren't out there, yes, we were out there to win, but we were more out there because this was a student project, and we wanted to include as many people as we possibly could in the period of time that we had. Is that
awesome? I just think this is a great thing. Diego, Casey, and Ryan put together for you guys, to see you guys all sitting up there together again with a common interest early in your life, and to come back around. I think it's pretty amazing, and you guys did a great job, all three of you. I have one more question. Where did the money come for the fuel, the oil, and the antifreeze and all that? Was that something you grabbed out of your pockets, and what fuel did you use? Was it pump gas?
I'll do the best I can with that because we are running out of time. We had accepted membership dues for years and we never spent any money, and we had approximately $1,000 in the coffer when Jim gave us that car, and that was the money we used to buy the parts that weren't donated to us. But as far as the out-of-pocket expenses of going to the track, the entry fees, the gasoline, the oil, the things that didn't get donated, we paid for out of our own pocket. And And understand, we were not wealthy college students, trust me. Any other questions? We have one more.
This was also fantastic fun, by the way. It really was.
It was said you blew the motor. Did Oldsmobile supply you with another motor?
Again, because we got to get going here, I think I know the answer to that. Jim Miller was called again. Jim Miller was our benefactor, and he was not a happy camper. He did not want to give us another engine, but it turned out he did give us another engine. So
the graphics was updated on the car, and one of the things that us earlier guys saw, the graphics had added on the recorder JP, the backdoor man. It took us a while to figure out that was JP Miller.
So ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's edition of the seminar with the Project W31 guys. We're going to have another seminar tomorrow at noon. You're going to hear a lot of the same story. We're going to hear a lot of different commentary because that's just the way things evolve. But I'd like to thank you very much for attending. As probably most, if not all of you know, over there in the middle, there is a W31 display, and a lot of these gentlemen will be hanging out there, and you can ask them questions individually or collectively, and I myself at times will be there peddling my book. So thank you very much. Okay.
I'm Ken Garner. We sponsored this Ramrod collection here for the show this year. And I just wanted to throw it out there to you guys. With Steve Minore's help, who is one of the leading experts on these cars. If you don't find the car, I have a restoration shop in Florida, and I'd love to build you a replica. So I just wanted to put that out there for you.
Thank you. For those of you that are interested, we accumulated everybody's snapshots of the period. And understand this was in schematic camera days, and all the members that had a file that we kept in engineers typically don't throw away anything. Dennis, our video expert, he put together a loop here that shows all the snapshots of the car through the period. Everyone that we could find during that time period, we'll run it here until we get thrown off the stage for the next presentation. Oh, and we're running it at our booth too, so we don't get a chance to see it here.
Hello, I had a question for you. Hopefully, you can answer the question. I got a 69 Oldsmobile W31. This is a mod, original car. And I didn't know if you could tell me what that might represent.
So I'm going to get together with this guy. I probably know the answer to that one. Just wanted to thank everybody for the display, the time you spent with us, and make sure to catch up with these guys in the W31 display. Thanks again, everybody.